Summer 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The humid air shimmered in the sunlight, heavy with the scent of pine and tar from the wooden barracks. In the shade of a guard tower, a German prisoner of war lifted a glass bottle to his lips. Inside, a brown liquid fizzed and sparkled with strange life. He had never seen anything like it before. The label read, Coca-Cola. For a man who had fought across the deserts of North Africa, living on hard biscuits and ersatz coffee, the sweetness of that first taste was incomprehensible. Cold, effervescent, alive, it was as if civilization itself had been bottled. He paid 5 cents for it, the same price, the guards told him, that American children paid with their pocket money. For the first time, the enemy before him became not a monster of propaganda, but a mystery of prosperity. Across the United States that summer, 371,000 German prisoners would come to the same realization. Everything they had been told about American weakness began to dissolve, one sip at a time. They had been warned of a nation of decadence, soft, chaotic, disorganized. Instead, they discovered a country where ice cream was a routine dessert, where candy bars were so plentiful that guards gave them away, where even enemies could taste the abundance of freedom. To the men of the Africa Corps, captured in the burning sands of Tunisia, this new reality felt impossible. They had seen the Reich's glory fade into the dust. Now, behind barbed wire in a foreign land, they confronted a world that measured strength not through conquest, but through creation. They had entered the heart of a machine that could make sweetness seem infinite. When the Africa campaign ended in May 1943, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers, Germans and Italians alike, laid down their arms. They expected vengeance. They expected starvation. They had seen what war could make of men. But when they surrendered to the Americans, something unexpected awaited them: a meal. The Americans called them K-rations, small, square boxes filled with crackers, cheese, candy, fruit bars, cigarettes, and instant coffee. To U.S. soldiers, they were merely field food. To the captured men, they were feasts. Men who had eaten thin soup for months sat in silence, staring at the abundance before them. Crackers that didn't crumble to dust, chocolate that melted on the tongue, sugar that came not as a ration, but as a right. One German officer later told the Red Cross, "We thought we would be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army ever had. That was when we began to doubt everything we'd been told." On the docks of North Africa, Liberty ships waited like floating cities, each one a miracle of American production. One completed every 42 hours, thousands launched in a single year. Into these steel vessels the prisoners marched, expecting confinement and cruelty. Instead, they found bread, fresh bread, vegetables, meat, and milk with sugar. Coffee served hot in metal mugs. Naval records tell us that rations aboard those ships matched or exceeded the crew's own. 3,500 calories a day. Refrigeration units hummed below deck, keeping everything cool across the long Atlantic crossing. And then came the impossible. Ice cream. It appeared like an apparition. Soft, white, sweet, impossibly cold in the middle of the ocean. The USS General M.B. Stewart recorded in its logbook that on July 4, 1943, it served ice cream to prisoners. 10 gallons a batch. 10 gallons of democracy floating on salt water. For men who hadn't tasted such luxury since before the war, it was a revelation. They looked around the ship, at the steel corridors, the humming engines, the smooth operation of men and machines, all synchronized, all efficient. Everything, from the ice cream to the ship itself, seemed to say, "This is how a free people fight a war, not through fear, but through abundance." When the ships reached American shores, ports like Norfolk and Newport News, the prisoners stepped into a world that their imagination could not contain. The docks stretched farther than any harbor they'd known. Cranes lifted cargo effortlessly from Liberty ships that had carried more material in a week than entire German ports managed in a month. And there, beyond the fences, lay something even stranger. Shops filled with candy bars, soft drinks, and fresh fruit. The same treats that German civilians considered distant dreams were being sold casually to dock workers. At the port exchanges, shelves glittered with color: Hershey, Mars, Nestlé. A chocolate democracy. 5 cents apiece, the same price in Tennessee, in New York, in California. Every bar identical, every bottle of Coca-Cola tasting exactly the same. For technically minded Germans, this standardization defied reason. How could chaos produce perfection? How could democracy create uniformity? The train ride inland deepened the mystery. They expected cattle cars. Instead, they rode in passenger coaches. The seats were soft, the windows clear. The dining car, yes, a dining car, served fried chicken, vegetables, and coffee with pie. A meal served to enemies, as if they were travelers, not captives. In silence, they ate, stealing glances at the American countryside rolling past the windows. Farmhouses with painted barns, fields heavy with corn and wheat, roads alive with trucks and automobiles. Everything moved, an endless motion of production and supply. And yet there was no desperation, only rhythm, only abundance. Camp Crossville awaited them in the green hills of Tennessee. Barbed wire encircled the camp, but beyond it, trees swayed gently, and the air smelled of honeysuckle. The barracks had electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, heated rooms. It was more than many had known even in peacetime Germany. The camp's exchange, the PX, became their window into another civilization. Inside, shelves overflowed with goods: Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, candy bars in neat rows, ice cream in freezers, cigarettes and beer. The prisoners could buy them all, not with rations, but with wages. 80 cents a day, later a full $1. Enough to purchase 16 bottles of Coca-Cola or 16 chocolate bars every day. For men who had fought to the brink of exhaustion, such choices felt like hallucination. It wasn't the sugar alone that changed them. It was what it represented. Each bottle of Coca-Cola, perfectly chilled, perfectly carbonated, carried within it the mathematics of abundance. It was an equation of freedom and production. One factory in Atlanta could supply an army that stretched across the world. 5 billion bottles in a single year, each one tasting the same. The Coca-Cola company called it the pause that refreshes. For German prisoners, it became something else, a lesson in possibility. That a nation could be so rich in spirit, so sure of itself, that it could waste sweetness, casually, without concern. They saw American workers drink half a bottle and throw the rest away. To a man who had counted sugar cubes like gold, such waste was unthinkable. But that was the secret lesson. America's power was not its armies, but its ability to make even its excess feel ordinary. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the Tennessee hills, the prisoners would gather near the fences, bottles in hand, watching the fireflies blink in the humid air. They talked softly in their language, about home, about families, about what this land meant. One of them said, almost to himself, "If this is our enemy, then what are we fighting for?" No one answered. The bottle fizzed softly in his hand, the sound of carbonation merging with the hum of cicadas. Somewhere beyond the wire, an American boy was buying the same drink for a nickel, the same sweetness, the same taste, divided only by war. And in that moment, under the Tennessee twilight, the slow and silent transformation began. The journey inland became an education in itself. As the trains carried them north and west through the American interior, the prisoners watched a country in motion. The fields seemed endless, the roads alive with trucks, every small town humming with energy. At every siding, grain elevators rose like cathedrals, and freight trains thundered past, hauling tanks, lumber, and food. always food. From the windows of their coaches, the Germans saw what no propaganda could have prepared them for, a nation where scarcity was a foreign word. Even the railroads, mere instruments of transport, served hot meals to their passengers. Dining cars with polished tables and white cups, waiters in pressed uniforms, meals of fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and steaming coffee. For men who had crossed deserts in supply convoys that starved before they reached their destinations, this was not just comfort. It was revelation. When they reached the camps scattered across the heartland, in Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, each compound told the same story. The architecture varied, but the pattern was identical. Electric light, running water, heated barracks, sanitation that worked. Even the smallest camps possessed kitchens that gleamed with stainless steel and shelves stocked with sugar, flour, canned fruit, and meat. For German engineers among the prisoners, the system itself was a marvel. Every camp received supplies through an invisible network of distribution that ran like clockwork. Food never failed to arrive. Fresh milk was delivered daily. Bread, baked on site or brought from local bakeries, appeared every morning without fail. And then came the symbol of all symbols, ice cream. In Germany, ice cream had been a pre-war memory, a luxury reserved for the well-connected and long since vanished under rationing. Yet here, in the land of their captors, it appeared as routine summer fare. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on the 4th of July, 1943, the prisoners watched American cooks turn ice, salt, cream, and sugar into gallons of the frozen miracle. Some stared in disbelief. Others laughed aloud, like children rediscovering wonder. The heat of the southern sun could not compete with that cold, impossible sweetness melting on their tongues. In some camps, electric machines churned out tubs by the week. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan. Flavors that existed in memory only, now served to men in enemy uniforms. The act defied logic, yet the Americans called it ordinary. The officers among the prisoners tried to rationalize it. Surely this was theater, an illusion staged for their benefit. But when the weeks passed and the deliveries continued, crates of milk, sugar, and cream arriving without fail, it became impossible to deny. This abundance was real. In the kitchens, German orderlies witnessed habits that confounded them. Sugar heaped in open bowls, left on tables without measure. If it hardened from humidity, it was discarded and replaced. They saw hundreds of pounds of food thrown away for minor blemishes, bread fed to pigs, vegetables deemed not fresh enough. To men raised under the gospel of efficiency, it was waste on an unimaginable scale. But to the Americans, it was simply maintenance, the cost of plenty. One afternoon in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, a German cook stood before a barrel filled with hardened sugar, ready for disposal. His hands trembled. He had grown up in a household where a teaspoon of sugar was stretched across a week. Now he was watching hundreds of pounds thrown away because the crystals clumped. He turned to his American supervisor and asked, "You waste this?" The American shrugged and said, "It's cheaper to buy new." The words echoed in the prisoner's mind for days. Cheaper to buy new, a sentence that described an entire civilization. Chocolate followed the same logic. The military bought it by the ton, 380 million pounds during the war, more than Germany could dream of producing. The camp exchanges sold candy bars from Hershey, Mars, and Nestlé for a nickel each. Soldiers, guards, and prisoners alike bought them without thought. For the Germans, even this equality was disorienting. To stand in line beside their captors, buying the same chocolate at the same price from the same counter. For men trained in hierarchy, this democracy of consumption was the most radical lesson of all. At night, after roll call, the camps settled into quiet. Fireflies flickered across the grass. Somewhere, a radio played a Glenn Miller tune from the guardhouse. Inside the barracks, the prisoners wrote letters, carefully phrased for the censors, yet filled with awe. "We are treated well," they wrote, "and the food is good. We eat better here than our families at home." They didn't exaggerate. Army quartermaster records show that prisoners consumed between 3,300 and 3,600 calories daily, more than most American civilians, and nearly triple what German civilians received under rationing. Sugar bowls remained full. Milk flowed freely. Cakes and pies appeared on menus. When Thanksgiving came, every camp served turkey with stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, and pumpkin pie. It wasn't a propaganda gesture. It was policy. To a man raised under the iron order of the Reich, where strength came from sacrifice, this casual generosity was bewildering. America's power, they began to see, came not from control, but from release. It was the freedom to produce, to distribute, to consume, without fear, without privilege. By late 1943, the transformation had begun to take hold. The guards noticed it first. The prisoners laughed more easily. They volunteered for work details, singing as they marched. They sent requests for English lessons. And sometimes, after long shifts in the fields or factories, they would return to camp, line up at the PX, and buy Coca-Cola together, guards and prisoners clinking bottles through the wire fence. That sound, the soft collision of glass on glass, was the quietest truce of the war. Beyond the barbed wire, the country continued its relentless motion. Trains thundered eastward with supplies, trucks rolled out of Detroit and Akron and St. Louis, ships crowded the coasts. Yet, even in total war, the shelves of America remained full. Children licked ice cream cones in small towns. Teenagers bought sodas after school. Housewives baked pies with sugar that would have fed entire German villages. The prisoners saw it all. Some worked on farms, others in canneries or lumber yards. They saw wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, dairy herds so large that milk was stored in tanks the size of trucks. They saw food production that never stopped, even with millions of men overseas. They saw the machinery of democracy, vast, efficient, and endlessly productive. And slowly, realization began to dawn. The war they had fought for German superiority, for a vision of order and strength, had been waged against something they had not understood at all. The Americans did not rule through fear or discipline. They ruled through confidence, through an industrial and moral faith that the more they gave, the stronger they became. In Camp Crossville, one young prisoner kept a notebook hidden beneath his mattress. In neat handwriting, he recorded what he saw. Not strategy or ideology, but food. Sugar, meat, milk, chocolate, ice cream, bread, and the number of times it appeared each week. Years later, he would tell his son, "I understood America through its meals. Every breakfast, every dessert, every Coca-Cola was a lesson." And those lessons, written not in ink but in sweetness, were changing them. Cell by cell, thought by thought. By the time the first snow fell over Tennessee that winter, the men who had marched for the Reich now found themselves in a different kind of campaign. One fought not with rifles, but with memory. The taste of Coca-Cola, the cold shock of ice cream, the weight of a Hershey bar in the hand, these became their new symbols. They had crossed an ocean as soldiers of empire. Now, behind wire fences, they were becoming witnesses to democracy. Winter came softly that year. Snow dusted the pine forests of Alabama, blanketed the farmlands of Wisconsin, and turned the camp yards into quiet white fields. The war was still raging across oceans, but within the barbed wire, time seemed to slow. The prisoners rose before dawn to the sound of bugles, filed into mess halls warmed by coal stoves, and ate breakfasts richer than they had known in years. Eggs, toast, bacon, butter, sometimes even oatmeal sweetened with sugar. The same question passed silently between them every morning. How could a nation at war still afford such plenty? Outside the fences, life carried on. America was a country in motion. its factories roaring day and night, its farms spilling out mountains of grain and vegetables. And soon the prisoners became part of that great machine. The Geneva Convention permitted their labor, and so across the American countryside, German hands helped harvest cotton, pick oranges, cut lumber, and stack hay. They replaced American farm boys who had gone to Europe or the Pacific. At first, they worked under guard, but within weeks the guards began to relax. Farmers learned the prisoners were not monsters. They were young men, tired and polite, who labored well and asked little. In some places, they were invited to lunch. The meals were simple: sandwiches, coffee, sometimes a slice of pie, but to the prisoners they felt like ceremonies. To sit at an American table, to eat from the same plates as the family that employed them, was more shocking than any battlefield. One prisoner, a teacher before the war, later wrote, "It was as if they did not see us as enemies. They saw us as workers, as men." It was not an illusion. Across the country, hundreds of families formed quiet friendships with their captives. Mothers sent food back with them to the camps: jars of preserves, loaves of bread, even Christmas cakes wrapped in wax paper. Some wrote letters after the war, keeping contact for years. Inside the camps, the holiday season of 1943 became a turning point. When Christmas arrived, the U.S. Army issued the same meal to every soldier and prisoner in the country: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, dressing, gravy, peas, cranberry sauce, buttered rolls, and pumpkin pie. To the Germans, it was another impossible thing. Not the feast itself, but the equality. No distinction between conqueror and captive. In Camp Hearn, Texas, the prisoners were even given small trees to decorate. They carved ornaments from scraps of wood, folded stars from paper, and sang carols in both languages. On Christmas Eve, the guards stood outside the wire, listening. For a few minutes, the sounds of Silent Night and Stille Nacht blended in the cold air, the two versions indistinguishable. Afterward, when the lights dimmed, one of the guards said softly, "It sounded like home." The Germans began to notice something else too: a freedom of speech unlike anything they had known. They could argue, joke, criticize their own leaders without fear of informers or punishment. The American commandant enforced discipline, but not ideology. There were no slogans on the walls, no portraits, no demands for loyalty. If they worked hard and behaved, they were rewarded. If they disobeyed, they were punished, but only for their actions, never their thoughts. It was an education in a different kind of power. By spring of 1944, the American guards had grown used to their charges. Some even forgot to call them prisoners. They were simply the Germans. They worked in the fields, they fixed machinery, they built furniture for local schools. At harvest time, they stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers under the same blazing sun. And when the work was done, they were paid. Not much, but enough to buy small luxuries at the camp canteen: cigarettes, shaving soap, writing paper, and always Coca-Cola. It became the ritual of evening, a bottle of Coke after labor, drunk slowly in the fading light. For men who had marched across North Africa and seen comrades die in the dust, this was not just refreshment. It was the rediscovery of being alive. The American Red Cross arranged films for them: comedies, westerns, even newsreels. They saw Frank Capra's Why We Fight, and though many recognized its message as propaganda, they couldn't deny the power of its images. A few found themselves wondering if their own country had ever made a film that proud, that confident in its goodness. Not all prisoners changed. Some officers clung fiercely to their beliefs, insisting that comfort was a weapon, that America's abundance was moral decay. But for the younger men, something within was quietly breaking and reforming. They began to see that freedom was not chaos, and that strength could be generous. Then, in June 1944, word spread through the camps: the Allies had landed in France. The war, they knew, was entering its final act. New prisoners arrived: gaunt, hollow-eyed men captured in Normandy and Italy. They stared at the food, the beds, the order, and fell silent. Some wept. They had expected vengeance, not mercy. By that autumn, the camps swelled again. The Americans handled the influx with the same efficiency. More tents, more kitchens, more meals. The food never stopped. When Thanksgiving came again that year, there were now tens of thousands of German men across America sitting to eat turkey, gravy, and pumpkin pie, while their families back home survived on black bread and turnip soup. The contrast burned in them. One prisoner at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, wrote in his diary, "We have 3 meals a day, music, clean clothes, and enough sugar for our coffee. My wife writes that our child cries for food. I cannot understand this world." And yet the kindness continued. In some camps, local children sang carols through the fences. In others, church groups brought small gifts, Bibles, cookies, postcards of the town. One evening, in a camp near Rupert, Idaho, the prisoners were invited to attend a Christmas service at the local church. They sat in the back pews, still in uniform, while townspeople sang "Joy to the World." No one jeered, no one spat. They were simply guests. The sermon that night was about forgiveness. Most of them didn't understand every word, but they understood the tone. Quiet, steady, without hatred. When they returned to camp, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Through 1944 and into 1945, the war dragged on across the oceans. But in the heart of America, another battle was being won. One fought in kitchens and fields, in shared labor and unexpected civility. The Germans began writing differently in their diaries, no longer just reports of food and weather, but reflections. They wrote about the kindness of guards, the laughter of farm children, the way Americans argued freely about politics without fear. They began to ask questions. What kind of country feeds its enemies this well? What kind of people treat captives with this much dignity? For some, the answers came slowly. For others, they came like lightning. The realization that everything they had been taught about freedom, race, and strength was false. That democracy was not weakness, but a force greater than any army. And so, behind barbed wire, among men who had once served Hitler, something astonishing was happening. Not defeat, but awakening. By the spring of 1945, the air itself seemed to change. The American guards could feel it first, a stillness that followed the radio reports from Europe. The war, once distant and unending, was collapsing in on itself. The prisoners sensed it too. The roll calls were quieter now. Letters from home came less often, and when they did, they carried the tone of endings. News trickled through the grapevine. Cities burned. The Rhine was crossed. The Führer spoke rarely. Some camps were shown newspapers, others heard the headlines read aloud. But whether official or whispered, the truth could no longer be denied. Germany was dying. And with that knowledge came silence. In Camp Aliceville, a man who had once lectured his peers on discipline and sacrifice sat by the fence one afternoon, staring at nothing. His uniform was still neat, his boots polished, but his face had changed. For years he had preached that the Reich would rise again. Now even he did not speak. On May 8, 1945, the prisoners awoke to the sound of bells. The guards were celebrating. The war in Europe was over. Across America, church bells rang, whistles blew, flags unfurled. But inside the camps, there was no joy, only a heavy, uncertain quiet. The Germans stood in formation as the news was read. Some bowed their heads. A few wept. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes dry, their thoughts locked somewhere far away. It was not defeat they mourned, but the revelation of what that defeat meant. In the days that followed, the Red Cross brought newspapers, photographs, and newsreels. The images were undeniable. The ruins of Berlin, the liberation of camps whose names they had never spoken aloud. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The photographs spread from hand to hand like poison. Some refused to believe. Others collapsed under the weight of it. The silence that fell across the barracks that week was unlike any before. Deep, stunned, reverent. For men who had spent their lives believing they fought for order and civilization, the truth was unbearable. The American guards, unsure what to say, gave them space. Work details continued. Meals were served. But something fundamental had shifted. The war was over, and the prisoners were no longer enemies. They were witnesses. A few weeks later, an American officer stood before the assembled men and read a statement from Washington. The United States would begin the repatriation of all German prisoners. There were cheers from some, relief from others, but also hesitation. They had dreamed of home for years, yet now home meant rubble, hunger, and shame. That summer, the camps entered a strange twilight. With the fighting ended, routine lost its urgency. Guards and prisoners shared conversations freely. Radios played big band music again. In some camps, the fences remained locked. In others, they stood open. The prisoners trusted to return each evening. And they always did. One evening in Camp Tunisia, the local community hosted a baseball game between American guards and German prisoners. Hundreds of townspeople came to watch. The uniforms were mismatched, the play was clumsy, but the laughter was real. When a German batter hit a line drive past second base, the crowd cheered as if for one of their own. Later, both teams shared lemonade under the bleachers. The guards smoked. The prisoners smiled. No one mentioned the war. That night, as the lights dimmed over the barracks, the prisoners lay awake, thinking of what awaited them across the Atlantic. The ruins of cities, the hunger of families, the long rebuilding. But beneath the dread was something else, an idea that would not fade. They had seen a world where fear did not rule, a place where ordinary people, even in wartime, could laugh, work, and feed their enemies without malice. Letters began to change again. The tone was softer, more reflective. "We have learned much here," one wrote. "The Americans believe that freedom is strength. They may be right." In the mess halls, meals continued as before. Bacon, potatoes, butter, bread. The same generosity, now tinged with farewell. Every dish felt symbolic. Every dessert a reminder of what they had witnessed. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, chocolate. The flavors of a civilization that had defeated them not only with weapons, but with abundance. When the first transport orders came, there was both joy and sorrow. Men packed their few belongings, letters, carvings, notebooks, small gifts from American farmers. At roll call, they shook hands with guards, exchanged addresses, promised to write. Some wept openly. In Camp Shelby, one group of prisoners was marched to the train station under a summer sky streaked with gold. Townspeople gathered to watch. The men boarded slowly, waving from the windows as the train began to move. And then, in a gesture that seemed almost too symbolic to be real, one of the guards climbed aboard and handed out bottles of Coca-Cola. One last taste of America. As the train pulled away, the sound of bottles clinking filled the air again. That same small sound of peace that had first echoed through the wire years before. Across the country, the camps emptied. Fences were dismantled, barracks torn down, fields planted again. By the end of 1946, nearly all the prisoners had gone home. But what they carried back with them could not be measured in luggage or rank. They carried the memory of freedom, not the abstract kind, but the kind you can taste, smell, and touch. The kind that serves dessert to its enemies. In the years to come, many of them would tell their children about the war, but not about the battles. They spoke instead of the food, the kindness, the absurd normalcy of America in wartime. They described the first time they tasted ice cream, the way the Coca-Cola fizzed against their teeth, the laughter of farmers' wives who fed them pie, and quietly, in towns and villages across Germany, that memory became a seed. A generation of men who had known both tyranny and mercy began to rebuild, not just walls, but ideals. They had seen what strength could look like when it smiled instead of shouted. They had been defeated, yes, but in defeat, they had discovered a truth greater than victory. The journey home began in slow waves. Ships crossed the Atlantic under gray skies, their holds filled not with soldiers of conquest, but with men who had learned humility. They stood on deck as the shoreline of America faded, the last outline of a country that had conquered them not with hatred but with decency. For many, the voyage was silent. They leaned against the rails, watching gulls circle above the endless water, their thoughts turning inward. Behind them lay the clean camps, the laughter, the fields of plenty. Ahead lay a homeland of ashes. When they reached Europe, the shock was immediate. The docks of Le Havre were rubble. Cities once filled with music and light were now hollow shells. Bridges gone, roads cratered, families scattered. Some returned to villages where nothing remained but chimneys standing like gravestones. Others searched in vain for names that no longer existed on any register. They found their country broken not just in body, but in spirit. The Reich they had fought for had devoured itself. The promises of glory had ended in famine and shame. And yet, as they stepped back into that ruin, they carried a quiet resilience, a memory that set them apart from those who had never left. They had seen another way to live. In towns where bread was rationed and children played among ruins, these men began to rebuild, with hands that had once saluted and now only worked. They tilled soil again, repaired houses, cleared the debris of ideology. And in conversations whispered over meager dinners, they spoke of what they had witnessed across the ocean. They spoke of America, of the fields that never ended, of milk that never ran out, of guards who shared cigarettes and laughter. They told their children that freedom did not mean chaos, that democracy did not mean weakness, that power could exist without cruelty. For many Germans who had never seen beyond the Reich's borders, these stories sounded like fables. A land where enemies ate the same food, where even prisoners had dessert, where people disagreed freely and still remained whole. It was almost impossible to imagine. Yet from these stories an image of America took root in postwar Germany. Not the conqueror, but the teacher. In 1947, one former prisoner, now a farmer near Hanover, wrote to his American host family from the camp days, "I plant corn, as you showed me. I use the same words you did: faith, work, and patience. My children drink milk every morning, and I tell them it is a gift you once gave me." Across the Atlantic, thousands of letters like it arrived in American mailboxes, written in careful English, each signed with gratitude. The friendships born through barbed wire endured long after the fences had gone. Some exchanged photographs. Some visited decades later. A few married American women they had met through church programs. And for the men who never returned to America, the memories persisted like a quiet compass. When Germany divided, and later when it rose again from ruin, many of these former prisoners became teachers, engineers, farmers, and fathers who shaped the nation's rebirth. They built schools without slogans, factories without fear. They taught their children that dignity was not a weapon, but a promise. One former Luftwaffe pilot who had worked on an Alabama farm told his grandson years later, "The Americans defeated me with milk and kindness. I never forgot that." Through the 1950s and beyond, the story repeated itself, quietly, modestly, but powerfully. The men who had once sworn loyalty to a dictator had learned democracy in a mess hall. They had absorbed its lessons not from books, but from behavior, from the way an American sergeant said, "please," from the way food was shared, from the absence of fear. And in that way, the moral architecture of post-war Germany was built in part from the memory of its captives' captors. Even decades later, when journalists interviewed surviving prisoners, their recollections were astonishingly consistent. Not the battles, not the surrender, but the food, always the food. The sugar bowls that were never empty, the ice cream on summer days, the Coca-Cola bottles passed through the wire. To them, these were not trivial details. They were symbols. edible proof that civilization could be merciful and still be strong. They remembered the sound of laughter in the barracks when a guard shared his sandwich. They remembered the way the guards never struck them, even when provoked. They remembered the baseball games, the music, the endless trains carrying food instead of fear. And when they spoke of America, their voices softened. Time passed. The camps vanished. The fences rusted away. The fields grew over with grass. But somewhere, across 2 continents, the echo of that quiet transformation remained. The clink of glass bottles, the taste of cold sweetness on a hot day. These small human moments became the bridge between enemies. By the century's end, historians would call it a moral victory. But to those who lived it, it was something simpler, a rediscovery of humanity. They had arrived as soldiers of a fallen empire, convinced that order required domination. They returned as witnesses to a truth greater than any nation, that kindness, multiplied, becomes power, that a full table can be stronger than a full armory, that freedom, once tasted, can never be forgotten. And so, in the quiet of old age, when they sat with grandchildren who asked about the war, they rarely spoke of the guns or the marches. They told instead of the day they first tasted ice cream in Mississippi, of the American farmer who shared coffee after work, of the laughter that crossed the wire. They told of a place where even enemies were fed, and of how that changed everything. Because in the end, it was not the battlefields that transformed them. It was the kitchens, the meals, the mercy. That was America's quiet victory. Not written in blood or glory, but in sugar, milk, and faith. And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The soft echo of bottles clinking under a foreign sun, the sound of forgiveness made visible. The war ended long ago, but that sound never did.